On July 17, 1944, 57,000 German prisoners were forced to march through the streets of Moscow. They had been captured weeks earlier during Operation Bagration, an offensive that wiped out Army Group Center in Belarus. Stalin ordered their transfer to the capital, not to interrogate them, not to hide them, to display them. The selection was precise. Only those who could walk for hours without collapsing were included, officers at the front, soldiers behind, some with intact insignias, others with the same uniforms they had been captured in, dirty, torn, without medical attention. They marched in silence, without visible escorts, for almost 8 hours. The route was carefully planned. When they finished, municipal vehicles washed the streets they had marched through. It was not a ceremony, it was a psychological operation, an internal and external message. Why did Stalin organize this parade? What was he trying to prove? And what fate awaited those 57,000 men after the march? Operation Bagration, the day the Eastern Front collapsed. On June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years after the start of Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army launched Operation Bagration against German positions in Belarus. This carefully planned offensive would become the most devastating operation against German forces on the Eastern Front and would lay the groundwork for the eventual defeat of the Third Reich. During the spring of 1944, the German Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal Ernst Busch, maintained a prominent position in Soviet territory. This formation had withstood numerous Soviet attacks since 1941, and the Germans were confident in their ability to continue doing so. The German High Command made a crucial strategic error by predicting that the next major Soviet offensive would occur in Ukraine, not in Belarus. This incorrect assessment led Hitler to order the transfer of panzer divisions and strategic reserves to the south, leaving Army Group Center significantly weakened. Meanwhile, the Red Army secretly concentrated impressive forces: over 2 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, 30,000 pieces of artillery, and 5,000 aircraft. The Soviet General Staff implemented military deception measures, maskirovka, including night movements, false deployments in Ukraine, and absolute radio silence. General Georgy Zhukov coordinated the offensive with precision. 4 army fronts formed a semicircle around the German positions. The strategy did not merely aim to defeat the enemy, but to annihilate it completely. The operation began with an intense artillery bombardment. Thousands of artillery pieces and Katyusha rocket launchers simultaneously attacked German defenses. This systematic bombardment allowed Soviet infantry to advance toward already weakened enemy positions. German communication lines were quickly broken, isolating frontline units from their headquarters. Many defensive positions, occupied by inexperienced soldiers after years of attrition warfare, were surrounded before they understood the magnitude of the attack. Soviet armored forces exploited these gaps efficiently, penetrating deeply and encircling entire German formations. Vitebsk, a key point in the German defenses, fell in a few days. 5 German divisions were eliminated from the order of battle. This pattern repeated across the front as Soviet forces advanced with unprecedented speed. German commanders requested authorization to retreat to more defensible positions, but Hitler ordered that each position be held to the last man, turning what could have been an organized retreat into a disastrous rout. By early July, the Soviet advance had reached an unexpected depth. Minsk, the capital of Belarus, considered a fortress city, was captured on July 3rd. More than 100,000 German soldiers were trapped in a large pocket east of the city. Material losses were enormous. Aerial reconnaissance photos showed long columns of destroyed vehicles on Belarusian roads. The speed of the Soviet advance prevented effective evacuations, resulting in the abandonment of vast amounts of equipment. Human losses were even more significant. Of the 38 divisions that made up Army Group Center at the beginning of the summer, 28 were completely destroyed, and the rest were rendered ineffective. Field Marshal Busch was relieved of command and replaced by Field Marshal Model, known for his ability to stabilize critical situations, but even he could not reverse the situation. The defeat caused an unprecedented organizational and psychological collapse. Surviving German officers described a complete disintegration of the command structure. Troops fled without orders, abandoning positions and wounded comrades. Some units, completely isolated, surrendered en masse. For the Soviet command, Bagration exceeded all expectations. In 5 weeks, the Red Army advanced 450 kilometers, liberating all of Belarus and part of eastern Poland. The front line moved from deep within Russia to the borders of East Prussia. More importantly, the operation definitively destroyed the myth of German invincibility. The strategic consequences extended to other fronts. Hitler was forced to transfer divisions from other theaters, including France, where the Allies had landed in Normandy. This weakening of defenses in the West accelerated the Allied advance. Germany was now facing a two-front war with insufficient strategic reserves. More than 160,000 German soldiers were captured, including 19 generals. Of these prisoners, 57,000 would be selected for a specific purpose: to participate in a parade through the streets of Moscow that would visually demonstrate Germany's defeat. As the Red Army continued its advance westward, columns of prisoners marched in the opposite direction. They passed through towns and cities they had previously occupied, now as captives before the eyes of the Soviet population. For these citizens, the sight of defeated German soldiers provided the first tangible evidence of the war's changing fortunes. The prisoners were unaware that Stalin had conceived a special purpose for them. The Soviet leader would invert Hitler's dream of marching triumphantly through Moscow, turning it into a march of defeat that would be etched into historical memory. The revenge of Stalin, when Hitler's dream turned into ruins. In the summer of 1941, as German tanks crossed the Soviet borders, Adolf Hitler imagined his ultimate triumph: a victorious parade through Moscow's Red Square. German officers informally discussed which units would lead the procession and which Soviet buildings would fly Nazi flags. Hitler himself planned to watch this spectacle personally from atop Lenin's mausoleum. 3 years later, as the Red Army was destroying the Army Group Center in Belarus, Joseph Stalin recalled these German aspirations. The Soviet leader saw an opportunity for perfect symmetry. The Germans would indeed march through Moscow, but as prisoners, not as conquerors. What Hitler had envisioned as a display of Aryan supremacy would become a demonstration of Soviet power and Nazi defeat. This idea developed in Stalin's mind during the crucial days of July 1944. Constant reports were arriving at the Kremlin about the overwhelming success of Operation Bagration. The reports detailed the destruction of German divisions, the capture of generals, and the mass abandonment of equipment. More importantly, they described columns of prisoners stretching for miles behind Soviet lines. These were not ordinary soldiers. They represented the feared Wehrmacht that had almost captured Moscow, besieged Leningrad, and devastated Stalingrad. Their public humiliation would serve multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. Stalin summoned Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD, to discuss the implementation of what would become the Great Waltz Operation. The name itself carried a bitter irony, a reference to a popular pre-war American musical film. Where the film depicted elegant Viennese aristocracy, this operation would showcase defeated Germans marching through hostile streets. The moment proved particularly opportune. On July 20th, 1944, a group of German officers led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg attempted to assassinate Hitler at his Eastern Prussian headquarters. The bomb killed 4 men but left Hitler with minor injuries. The plot's failure triggered a wave of executions and purges throughout the German military and civil administration. Stalin did not see the assassination attempt as an act of moral courage, but rather as evidence of fractures within the Nazi regime. While the Western Allies might have viewed the conspirators as heroes opposing Hitler's tyranny, Stalin's perspective was coldly pragmatic. These conspirators were not revolutionaries or democrats, but conservative aristocrats and military officers attempting to save what remained of Germany by removing Hitler. For Stalin, the Stauffenberg plot represented a troubling possibility that the German military leadership might overthrow Hitler, establish a new government, and negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies while continuing to fight against the Soviet Union. Such a scenario would deny the USSR its legitimate territorial gains and influence in post-war Europe, invalidating the immense sacrifice of the Soviet people. The Moscow parade would counter this narrative by demonstrating that the German army was not merely politically committed, but militarily defeated. There would be no new stab-in-the-back myth for Germany to cultivate after this war, nor claims that the German armies remained undefeated on the battlefield. The visual evidence of Wehrmacht soldiers, dirty, defeated, marching under Soviet guard, would testify to a complete military collapse. For internal consumption, the parade satisfied a deep psychological need. Soviet citizens had endured unimaginable suffering since 1941. Cities destroyed, families annihilated, economies devastated. The sight of captured enemies would provide tangible proof that sacrifice led to victory, that Soviet resistance had overcome German aggression. It would transform abstract military reports into visible reality. Stalin instructed Pravda and other state media to prepare the Soviet public without revealing specific details. Articles began to describe the historical justice awaiting the Nazi invaders, hinting at an unprecedented display of Soviet triumph. Moscow residents noticed heightened security measures and unusual military activity, but they received no official explanation until shortly before the event. Soviet propaganda typically focused on heroic narratives: brave soldiers, selfless workers, patriotic citizens. This approach would be different. The parade would not show Soviet strength but German weakness. The spectators would be silent witnesses to the enemy's humiliation rather than active participants in Soviet glory. The event would feel less like a celebration and more like a sentence. The psychological dimension extended beyond the parade itself. Stalin ordered the entire process to be documented, from the selection of prisoners to their transportation to Moscow and eventual sending to labor camps. The footage would be edited for maximum impact and distributed to allied and neutral countries. The world would see not only that Germany was losing the war, but that its defeat was absolute and irreversible. For Stalin, always conscious of his place in history, the parade also served as personal validation. In 1941, the Soviet Union had been on the brink of collapse. Foreign observers predicted Soviet defeat within weeks. Stalin himself had briefly disappeared from public view, supposedly overwhelmed by the initial German successes. Now the tide had completely turned. The parade would commemorate not only the Soviet victory, but Stalin's leadership through the crisis. The meticulous planning reflected Stalin's understanding of power as theater. Every element, from the selection of the route to the order of march and the symbolic street cleaning afterward, was choreographed for maximum psychological impact. The Germans would march along Gorky Street, the grand boulevard of Moscow, passing key government buildings and historic squares. They would see the city they failed to conquer, intact and imperious. Meanwhile, the NKVD received precise instructions for the selection of prisoners. The parade required men who could physically complete the march without collapsing, a consideration that ironically improved their short-term treatment. They needed high-ranking officers to lead the procession, demonstrating that the defeat encompassed all levels of German command. They required representatives from various military units to illustrate the all-encompassing nature of the German surrender. As preparations proceeded in secrecy, Stalin contemplated the broader implications of this spectacle. The defeat of Army Group Center had opened a path to Berlin. Soviet forces were ready to enter Poland, Romania, Hungary, and eventually Germany itself. The balance of power was shifting decisively, not only militarily, but diplomatically. At the inevitable peace conference, the USSR would speak from a position of strength, demanding recognition of its sacrifices and security needs. The parade would serve as a prelude to this new reality, a visual statement that the Soviet Union would not be sidelined in the victory as it had been in the pre-war diplomacy. The Germans, who once thought to colonize Slavic lands, considering them inferior, would march as captives through a Slavic capital. The architects of Operation Barbarossa would witness the consequences of their miscalculation. Stalin's vision transformed what could have been a mere prisoner transfer into a transcendental historical statement. Through this inverted parade, Hitler's dream would become his nightmare, and Moscow would witness not its conquest, but its revenge. Grand Val's operation, the choreography of the Nazi defeat. The transformation of a military victory into political theater required precise planning comparable to combat operations. Behind the seemingly simple concept of parading prisoners through Moscow was a complex web of logistical challenges, security considerations, and psychological calculations. The NKVD, responsible for implementing Stalin's vision, approached the task with its characteristic meticulousness. Lavrenti Beria personally supervised the operation. The first challenge was selecting appropriate candidates from the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners captured during Operation Bagration. Medical teams were deployed to temporary detention camps near the Belarusian front. Their criteria were specific. Prisoners had to be physically capable of completing a multi-kilometer march without collapsing, creating an unintended irony where the captives were given better short-term treatment to ensure their participation in their own humiliation. NKVD doctors conducted exams, checking for the absence of serious injuries, malnutrition, or infectious diseases that could prevent them from completing the march. From this initial selection, approximately 57,000 prisoners were deemed suitable candidates, a number calibrated to create an overwhelming visual impact without becoming logistically unmanageable. The selection process prioritized the diversity of military units, ensuring representation from infantry, armor, artillery, and support services. This would demonstrate that the defeat encompassed the entire Wehrmacht, not just isolated formations. Special attention was given to capturing the command structure. 19 generals and 6 colonels were selected to lead the procession, their presence serving as irrefutable evidence of a comprehensive defeat. These senior officers would receive special treatment. They would march in clean uniforms with their medals and insignia intact, emphasizing their former status in stark contrast to their current circumstances. The rank-and-file soldiers, on the other hand, were deliberately kept in the disheveled state of their capture. They would not be allowed to bathe, shave, or change clothes before the parade. Their appearance, dirty, unshaven, in torn uniforms and makeshift footwear, would visually reinforce Soviet narratives about the degradation of the once powerful German army. Transportation posed the next major challenge. Moving 57,000 men from frontline detention areas to Moscow required meticulous planning. Between July 14th and 16th, 1944, dozens of trains departed from collection points near Minsk and other Belarusian cities. Each transport carried approximately 1,500 prisoners packed into cattle cars. The journey lasted between 24 and 48 hours, with minimal water and basic rations provided. Upon arrival in Moscow, the prisoners were transferred to 3 main facilities: the Dynamo Stadium, the Central Moscow Hippodrome, and the Dzerzhinsky Division Cavalry Regiment camp. These locations provided both appropriate security and proximity to the planned parade route. Here, the prisoners were organized into marching columns of exactly 600 men each, with 20 soldiers per row, dimensions calculated to maximize the visual impact while maintaining control. Security concerns dominated the NKVD planning discussions. The parade presented multiple risks: prisoner escape attempts, violent civilian responses to the captured Germans, or even attacks on the proceedings by remaining German sympathizers. The solution combined visible and invisible security measures. Ostensibly, NKVD officers mounted with unsheathed sabers would escort the columns, their reduced number projecting Soviet confidence while maintaining psychological control. Behind this visible security perimeter lay a much more integral apparatus. More than 12,000 civilian NKVD officers were positioned along the route and among the crowd. Regular army troops established blockades at key intersections and potential escape routes. Snipers positioned on rooftops kept watch over the entire procession. Moscow's civil authorities were instructed to immediately report any suspicious behavior. The parade route was selected for maximum psychological impact. Starting at different points, both main contingents would pass through the center of Moscow, following routes designed to emphasize the city's grandeur and its unscathed state without bombings. The main route followed the Leningrad Highway to Gorky Street, passing Mayakovsky Square before culminating at Kurskaya Station. The secondary route passed through the Garden Ring to Kanachikovskaya Station. The timing was precisely calculated. The parade would begin at 11 a.m. on July 17th, when sunlight would provide optimal visibility and photographic conditions. The pace was deliberately set slow, approximately 2 kilometers per hour, extending the exposure of the prisoners to the public view. The anticipated ending time was set for 7 p.m., creating a full-day spectacle of the German defeat. A distinctive logistical feature emerged in the post-parade planning. Municipal tanker trucks were scheduled to follow the last prisoners, symbolically washing the streets. This theatrical flourish, cleaning Moscow of the German presence, carried powerful symbolism that Soviet propaganda would emphasize in subsequent coverage. Documentation requirements added another dimension to the preparations. Camera positions were scouted days before, with platforms built at key observation points. Soviet filmmakers were given specific instructions on capturing both the German faces and the civilian reactions. Static cameras would document the overall scale, while mobile units followed the procession to capture close-up details. The Soviet press received careful guidance on coverage. Headlines and terminology were standardized. Phrases like Hitler's defeated armies and the invasion that failed consistently appeared in all publications. The narrative emphasized historical justice over revenge, the inevitable consequence of aggression rather than Soviet retribution. As July 17th approached, final preparations accelerated. The prisoners received their last meal, a calculated portion of bread and porridge designed to provide enough energy to march without improving their appearance. Column leaders received final instructions on maintaining formation and pace. Security forces carried out final route inspections, removing potential obstacles and verifying contingency plans. At dawn on July 17, 1944, Operation Grand Waltz was ready for execution. What seemed to foreign observers like a simple display of captured enemies concealed months of planning, thousands of personnel, and complex logistical arrangements. Soviet leadership had designed not just a parade, but a carefully choreographed psychological weapon. The Parade of the Defeated, July 17, 1944, Shame in Red Square. On July 17, 1944, the day dawned clear in Moscow. By 8 a.m., an unusual silence had settled over the neighborhoods along Leningrad Road and Gorky Street. Residents were heading to predetermined viewing points, some carrying small children on their shoulders, others claiming positions in windows of buildings with a view of the parade route. Military police were stationed at intersections, redirecting regular traffic and setting up perimeters. At the Moscow Hippodrome, the day's protagonists gathered under heavy surveillance. 19 German generals and 6 colonels formed a single row, their uniforms clean, medals and insignia polished. Behind them stretched column after column of enlisted men and junior officers, approximately 42,000 in the main contingent, arranged in formations 20 men wide. Their appearance stood in stark contrast to their commanders. Unshaven faces, torn uniforms, improvised footwear, bandaged limbs, and the lost gaze characteristic of the defeated. A second contingent of about 15,000 prisoners gathered simultaneously in Mayakovsky Square, designated to follow the Garden Ring. Together, these 57,000 men made up the largest display of captured enemy forces in modern military history. At 11 a.m. sharp, Colonel General Pavel Artemyev, commander of the Moscow Military District, gave the signal. The parade began with a surreal stillness that set it apart from traditional Soviet military displays. No martial music accompanied the marchers. No announcer narrated their passage. No aircraft performed aerial demonstrations. The only sounds were boots on cobblestones, occasional coughs, and the ambient murmur of tens of thousands of spectators maintaining a collective, disciplined silence. The generals led the procession, their faces revealing various responses to their circumstances. Some maintained a rigid military posture, others showed unmasked hatred. A few exhibited signs of physical or psychological collapse. Lieutenant General Vincenz Müller, acting commander of the 4th German Army captured at Minsk, marched with his gaze forward, his face an impassive mask. Beside him, Major General Adolf Hamann, former commander of Bobruisk and ex-military governor of Orel, showed visible tension in his clenched jaw and rigidly controlled step. Behind them followed a block of more than 1,000 German officers arranged by rank, from colonels to lieutenants. Their collective behavior reflected professional military discipline, marching in step despite their captivity, maintaining formation despite exhaustion. This section of the parade served as visual evidence that the Wehrmacht's command structure had collapsed at all levels, from strategy to tactical leadership. The bulk of the parade was made up of ordinary soldiers, infantry, tank crews, artillerymen, communication operators, and support staff. They marched in blocks designated by unit or place of capture. The men who surrendered in Vitebsk, Bobruisk, Mogilev, and Minsk passed in separate formations, providing visual documentation of each phase of the Bagration offensive. The physical condition of these men told its own story of military collapse. Many limped due to untreated injuries. Others showed signs of malnutrition after weeks of encirclement. Some wore makeshift bandages stained with blood or pus. Their uniforms, once a symbol of German military precision, hung in tatters or showed the mud and ash of surrender on the battlefield. What was most striking were their expressions. Soviet cameramen, strategically positioned along the route, captured close-ups of faces that revealed the psychological impact of absolute defeat. Some marched with their heads down, unwilling to meet the eyes of the Soviet citizens. Others maintained defiant expressions, clenched jaws and eyes burning with undiminished hatred. Many displayed the empty stare of men whose military identity had completely collapsed. For the German prisoners forced to march through hostile streets, the experience marked a profound psychological turning point. Soldier Bernhard Braun, a 22-year-old infantryman captured near Minsk, would later describe, "We walked along the edges of the column looking at the Muscovites and they looked at us." I wondered, am I humiliated? Probably not. Worse things happen in war. We were used to following orders, so as we walked through the streets of Moscow, we were simply obeying the orders of our escorts. This emotional detachment, a psychological defense mechanism, appeared in multiple accounts from survivors. The former Wehrmacht Corporal Karl Schweitzer recalled, "I felt nothing during the march. My emotions had turned off days before when we were surrounded. I saw Moscow through a fog. I recorded buildings, faces, but they seemed unreal, like walking through someone else's nightmare." For others, the march was the definitive moment of confrontation with military reality. Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann, an artillery officer captured at Bobrusk, would later write in a diary entry that was confiscated, "Today, marching through the enemy capital we failed to capture, I finally understood what many of us had refused to acknowledge. The war is lost. Look how they watch us, not with hatred, but with the calm confidence of eventual victors." The population of Moscow watched this procession with restrained discipline. There were no cheers as might occur during victory celebrations. Objects were not thrown. No wave of vengeful emotion interrupted the procedure. Instead, the crowd maintained a studied silence that amplified the psychological impact of the spectacle. From the Soviet side, the reactions were also complex. Roman Schenko, then a teenager who had lost his father at Stalingrad, recalled the collective restraint. "We watched the Germans very closely in the midst of a stone-cold silence. No one said a word, neither they nor us. It was as if we were studying specimens from another world, these diminished men who had caused so much suffering. I looked for monsters but only saw defeated soldiers." This absence of the expected catharsis appeared in multiple civilian accounts. Ekaterina Mikhailovna, a factory worker whose home in Ukraine had been destroyed during the German occupation, described her surprise. "I came expecting to feel vindication, even hatred. Instead, I felt something unexpected, a hollow satisfaction. These men dragging themselves in filthy uniforms seemed pathetic rather than evil." For others, the parade provided the emotional closure they sought. Dmitry Voronov, a Red Army veteran who had lost his leg during the Battle of Moscow in 1941, traveled across the city with crutches to witness the spectacle. "When I saw them, especially the officers who had planned our destruction, something settled in my soul. The circle was complete. I didn't cheer or curse. I simply nodded, thinking, this is justice." The NKVD guards responsible for escorting the prisoners had their own conflicting reactions. Junior Lieutenant Pavel Klimov, assigned to the mounted escort, wrote in a private letter, "We were instructed to maintain absolute composure, not to show emotion or weakness. However, watching these former invaders drag themselves through our capital, men who would have shot me without hesitation months earlier, required extraordinary self-discipline. Every instinct screamed for personal vengeance, but our orders were to perform this task with cold professionalism." Among these opposing perspectives, rare moments of unexpected human connection arose. Zinaida Petrova, a Moscow schoolteacher whose brother had died defending Leningrad, recalled a fleeting interaction. "A young German soldier stumbled directly in front of me. Without thinking, I made a small gesture indicating he should straighten up before the guards noticed. He looked up, our eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between us, a momentary recognition of shared humanity in the midst of engineered hatred. Then the column moved. and he disappeared forever. The choreography of the march created a procession that seemed endless both for the participants and the observers. For almost 8 hours, columns of captured Germans moved through the central districts of Moscow, a physical manifestation of defeat measured not in minutes but in hours, not in hundreds but in tens of thousands. At key intersections, Soviet photographers and cameramen captured panoramic views of the procession stretching for miles. These images, intended for global distribution, conveyed the scale of German losses more effectively than any written dispatch or radio report. The route itself intensified the symbolic humiliation. The prisoners marched past monuments associated with Soviet power and resistance, government buildings that continued to function despite the German invasion, cultural institutions that preserved Russian heritage, and residential districts untouched by bombing that demonstrated the successful defense of Moscow. The path took them through neighborhoods where, 3 years earlier, Muscovites had dug anti-tank trenches and built barricades in desperate preparation for the German arrival. The security remained almost invisible, though omnipresent. Mounted NKVD officers with drawn sabers provided the only obvious escort, maintaining a ratio of about 1 guard for every 100 prisoners. This minimal visible security conveyed supreme confidence in Soviet control while highlighting German impotence. Behind this facade, thousands of plainclothes security agents kept watch from within the crowd and nearby buildings. As the afternoon turned to evening, the physical strain on the marchers became increasingly evident. Men who had started marching with military posture gradually hunched over from exhaustion. Some collapsed and were carried off to the side by their fellow prisoners. Water was provided sparingly, deliberately insufficient to quench their thirst in the summer heat. By 5 p.m., the initial columns began to reach their destinations: the Kurskaya station for the main contingent, the Kanachikovo station for the secondary group. There, cargo trains with cattle cars awaited to transport them to labor camps throughout the Soviet Union. The loading process was carried out efficiently but without haste, ensuring that Moscow residents returning from work could observe this final phase of German humiliation. The conclusion of the parade presented one last symbolic touch. As the last prisoners left each section of the route, municipal tanker trucks immediately began to spray the streets. This theatrical cleaning, washing away the physical presence of the enemy, carried a powerful symbolic meaning for the Soviet citizens. It visualized the removal of the German contamination from the sacred Soviet soil, a purification ritual performed before returning the streets to their normal use. At 7 p.m., the operation officially concluded. The last German prisoner boarded a transport train bound for the Soviet interior. General Colonel Artemyev signed the completion order. Radio Moscow announced that the demonstration of justice had ended. The city returned to its evening routines with an air of collective satisfaction, witnesses to a historic retribution executed through meticulous choreography. After the march, gulags, oblivion, and the slow death of the German army, the theatrical spectacle of July 17, 1944, ended with a final act invisible to the citizens of Moscow. As night fell, the last German prisoners disappeared into cattle cars at the Kurskaya and Kanachikovo stations. The doors slammed shut, the locks secured with heavy clicks, and the steam locomotives came to life. For these 57,000 men, the Moscow parade did not mark the end of their ordeal, but merely a public interlude in a much longer journey through the vast Soviet penal system. The trains departed eastward under the cover of darkness. Their destinations remained classified, known only to NKVD officials who oversaw the transports. These journeys stretched for days, sometimes weeks, crossing the Ural Mountains into Siberia, veering south toward Kazakhstan, or continuing on to the Soviet Far East. The crowded cattle cars held between 80 and 100 prisoners each, forcing the men to take turns standing while others sat or lay on the limited space of the floor. The summer heat turned these sealed metal compartments into mobile ovens. The water rations, deliberately minimized to reduce sanitary needs, proved insufficient against dehydration. Dysentery spread rapidly among the weakened bodies. Men who had survived combat, encirclement, capture, and the Moscow parade now succumbed to these primitive conditions. When the train stopped briefly, NKVD guards would remove corpses, recording the deaths in standardized logs without names, just numbers, reducing the transport inventory. Upon arrival at regional distribution centers, The prisoners underwent a classification that determined their subsequent fate. NKVD officers divided them by physical ability, military specialty, and security risk assessment. This classification process assigned human resources to the vast archipelago of labor camps spread across the Soviet interior. Special camps near Kemerovo and Vorkuta received miners and those capable of heavy labor. Former mechanics, engineers, and skilled technicians were sent to industrial facilities in Magnitogorsk, Chelyabinsk, and Norilsk. Agricultural specialists were dispatched to collective farms in Kazakhstan and the southern Urals. Officers considered to possess valuable intelligence underwent intensive interrogations at specialized facilities near Moscow before joining the general population of prisoners. The 19 generals who led the Moscow parade received distinctive treatment. Their value as propaganda assets and intelligence sources earned them accommodation in NKVD specialized facilities near Moscow. Here, Soviet military intelligence officers conducted extensive interrogations, extracting operational details about the German military organization, technology, and strategy. Some generals cooperated in the hope of receiving better treatment or eventual repatriation. Others maintained military discipline, providing only their name, rank, and service number despite psychological pressure and physical deprivation. Two generals faced particular scrutiny: Adolf Hamann and Gottfried von Erdmannsdorf. Both had served as military governors in Soviet-occupied territories where massive atrocities occurred. Unlike most prisoners of war, they would eventually face formal prosecution for war crimes. After extensive investigations documenting their command responsibility in civilian massacres, both were tried, convicted, and hanged in 1950. For the vast majority of prisoners, life settled into the unrelenting routine of the Gulag system. Daily existence revolved around work quotas, survival strategies, and managing despair. A typical day began before dawn with black bread and watery soup before 12-hour shifts in mines, forests, factories, or construction sites. The evening meals provided inadequate calories for the physical demands placed on weakened bodies. Winter temperatures in the Siberian camps dropped below -40 degrees, while summer brought swarms of mosquitoes and insects that tormented the men as they worked. The German prisoners integrated into a complex social ecosystem within the camps. Soviet political prisoners, criminals, and other foreigners created a hierarchy where Germans frequently occupied intermediate positions, below the Soviet authorities, but above certain other groups. Former Wehrmacht soldiers found themselves working alongside Soviet citizens whose homes, farms, and families they had destroyed during the invasion. Medical attention remained primitive at best, non-existent at worst. The infirmaries in the camps lacked basic supplies, medications, and trained personnel. Minor injuries became potentially fatal infections. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and limbs during the winter months. Vitamin deficiencies caused scurvy, night blindness, and dental health deterioration. Tuberculosis spread through overcrowded barracks, claiming thousands of lives annually. By 1947, it is estimated that 30% of the original participants in the march had died in captivity. Unlike combat, where action offered distraction from fear, life in the camp provided endless hours for reflection and regret. The men faced their role in a failed invasion, their complicity in the Nazi aggression, their abandonment by the German leadership, and their indefinite separation from homes and families. Some found meaning through religious faith, others through solidarity with fellow prisoners, many through simple daily survival routines. Communication with the outside world remained severely restricted. Until 1947, most prisoners did not receive mail or could not send messages home. Their families in Germany had no confirmation of survival, receiving only formal notifications that their sons, husbands, or fathers were missing in action. A bureaucratic limbo between hope and mourning. The Soviet Union had signed but never ratified the Geneva Convention that governed the treatment of prisoners. Stalin explicitly rejected appeals from the International Red Cross for inspections of camps or prisoner records, declaring that those who had invaded Soviet soil had lost conventional protections. When the Western Allies pressed for the repatriation of prisoners after Germany's surrender in May 1945, Soviet authorities responded that German prisoners were legitimate reparations for war damages, human compensation for the industrial capacity and infrastructure destroyed during the invasion. The first significant releases occurred in 1947, when approximately 20,000 prisoners classified as severely ill or physically incapable of productive work were repatriated to occupied Germany. These first returnees provided the first reliable accounts of conditions in the Soviet camp system. Their physically devastated appearance, emaciated bodies, missing teeth, prematurely aged faces, offered visible evidence of their ordeal. Subsequent repatriations occurred sporadically during the last years of the 1940s, with Moscow carefully calculating each release for maximum diplomatic and propaganda advantage. By 1949, approximately 30% of the surviving prisoners had returned to divided Germany, with preference given to those from the Soviet occupation zone, where their testimonies could be more effectively controlled. Stalin's death in March 1953 marked a turning point for the remaining prisoners. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, seeking diplomatic normalization with West Germany, accelerated the repatriation process. Between 1953 and 1956, the majority of surviving German prisoners returned home, including many who had participated in the Moscow parade 12 years earlier. Their return coincided with the economic miracle of West Germany and the socialist reconstruction of East Germany, two radically different Germanys emerging from the ruins of the Third Reich. These returning prisoners found societies eager to forget the war rather than confront its legacies. In West Germany, economic recovery and the realities of the Cold War discouraged any examination of the Wehrmacht's guilt or Soviet suffering. In East Germany, the official friendship with the Soviet Union forbade discussions about mistreatment of prisoners or forced labor. The men who had marched through Moscow found themselves marginalized in the national memory, their experiences too complex and uncomfortable for the simplified post-war narratives. Only in the 1980s and 1990s, when the tensions of the Cold War eased and both German states confronted their historical responsibilities, did the survivors begin to share their experiences publicly. Memoirs, oral histories, and documentaries captured their testimonies before they disappeared forever. These accounts revealed the Moscow parade as merely a visible moment in an extensive saga of captivity that shaped individual lives and collective memory long after the public spectacle had vanished from the headlines. The hidden legacy, propaganda, memory, and the eternal echo of the parade. The procession of German prisoners through Moscow on July 17, 1944, lasted less than a day, but its symbolic reverberations continue to echo in the historical memory, political narratives, and cultural representations of World War II. What began as a calculated propaganda exercise evolved into something more enduring, a visual benchmark for understanding how victory and defeat are represented, documented, and remembered. In the immediate aftermath, Soviet authorities extracted the maximum propaganda value from the event. Edited newsreel footage appeared in cinemas across the USSR within days, carefully sequenced to emphasize the degradation of the Germans and the Soviet triumph. Pravda published a special pictorial edition showing ragged prisoners juxtaposed with confident Moscow citizens. Moscow radio broadcast descriptions in multiple languages, ensuring global awareness of this symbolic inversion of Nazi ambitions. The political message was unequivocal. The invincibility of the Wehrmacht had been destroyed and Soviet victory was inevitable. International reactions revealed divergent perspectives on the spectacle. In Britain and the United States, the initial press coverage acknowledged the legitimate symbolism of the parade while expressing discomfort with the public humiliation of prisoners. The New York Times described it as a powerful demonstration of Soviet military success, but questioned whether such displays violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the Geneva Convention. British diplomatic cables revealed similar ambivalence, acknowledging both the propaganda effectiveness and the troubling precedent of using prisoners for public spectacle. In neutral countries, reactions varied according to political alignment. Swedish newspapers published extensive photographic essays with no editorial comment, allowing readers to draw their own conclusions. Swiss coverage emphasized the contrast between the German victory parades in Paris and the Moscow procession of defeat. In Argentina and Spain, countries with pro-German sympathies, publications minimized or omitted mention of the event, preferring to focus on ongoing combat operations rather than acknowledge the scale of German losses. Within Germany itself, Nazi authorities suppressed all information about the parade. Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda issued strict directives prohibiting any mention of captured generals or mass surrenders in Belarus. German newspapers continued to report strategic withdrawals and defensive successes while their army was collapsing in the east. This information blackout became increasingly difficult to maintain as families received no communication from soldiers who had gone missing during Operation Bagration. The end of the war in May 1945 transformed the meaning of the parade from a propaganda event to historical documentation. Soviet victory celebrations incorporated footage of the July 1944 parade as visual proof of the gradual and inexorable process of German defeat. The images acquired new context, no longer predicting eventual victory but confirming its achievement. The columns of prisoners marching through Moscow became visual shorthand for the collapse of Nazi military power, a precursor to the final surrender ceremonies in Berlin. During the early years of the Cold War, the parade acquired additional geopolitical significance. For Soviet authorities establishing control over Eastern Europe, the footage demonstrated both military dominance and psychological warfare capabilities. In educational materials across the new socialist bloc, the parade featured prominently, a reminder that Soviet power had defeated German militarism and could similarly overcome any future resistance. Polish, Czechoslovak, Hungarian, Romanian, and East German schoolchildren watched the footage in history classes, absorbing its lesson on the consequences of defying Soviet authority. In West Germany, evolving post-war perspectives complicated responses to the parade footage. Early post-war narratives emphasized German victimhood rather than aggression, focusing on Allied bombings, expulsions from Eastern territories, and mistreatment of prisoners. The Moscow parade, with its visual evidence of defeat and dishonor of the Wehrmacht, contradicted these narratives of German suffering. Consequently, historians and commentators in West Germany generally avoided or minimized discussion of the event until the 1960s, when younger generations began to confront Nazi-era responsibilities more directly. The authorities of East Germany faced different challenges integrating the parade into the official history. As a Soviet ally, East Germany could not condemn the treatment of German prisoners nor question Soviet conduct during the war. Instead, state historians developed a careful framework distinguishing between fascist aggressors, the leadership of the Wehrmacht and the Nazi Party, and deceived German workers, ordinary soldiers, who appeared in the parade. This interpretive approach allowed for recognition of the German defeat while preserving the narrative of subsequent German-Soviet friendship. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 transformed access to archival materials related to the parade. Previously classified NKVD planning documents, operational orders, and after-action reports became available to historians. These materials revealed the extensive preparation behind the seemingly spontaneous event, the careful selection of prisoners, the meticulous route planning, and the orchestrated press coverage. At the same time, Russian historians began to question certain aspects of the traditional Soviet narrative, particularly regarding the treatment of prisoners after the parade. In post-Soviet Russia, attitudes toward the parade reflected broader reconsiderations of the Stalinist legacy. Some historians emphasized the legitimate symbolism of the event without endorsing the subsequent mistreatment of prisoners. Others incorporated the parade into revisionist narratives, questioning the Western minimization of Soviet contributions to the defeat of the Nazis. Under Vladimir Putin's leadership, Russian historical memory increasingly embraced selective aspects of the Soviet war experience, including the Moscow parade as a demonstration of Russian resistance and eventual triumph over the invasion. Cinematically, footage of the parade attained iconic status. Scenes from the July 1944 event appeared in numerous documentaries about World War II, often marking the narrative turning point between Nazi advance and retreat. Soviet filmmaker Roman Karman incorporated the footage in his epic documentary The Judgment of Peoples, 1946, juxtaposing the Moscow parade with the subsequent Nuremberg trials, visual continuity between military defeat and legal judgment. Western documentarians similarly incorporated the footage, though often with a different narrative framing emphasizing the propaganda aspects or the human dimension of the defeat. Beyond factual documentation, the concept of the parade influenced fictional representations of victory and defeat. Numerous films, novels, and television productions incorporated scenes resembling the Moscow parade, sometimes explicitly referenced, other times merely suggested. This visual trope, conquered soldiers marching through enemy territory in triumph, became shorthand for absolute military collapse. The real historical event generated artistic reinterpretations that at times overshadowed an accurate understanding of the parade's original circumstances. For modern visitors to Moscow, the physical traces of the parade have disappeared. No monument marks the route where 57,000 prisoners marched under Soviet guard. Streets have been repeatedly repaved, buildings renovated or replaced, urban landscapes transformed through decades of development. However, the parade retains a ghostly presence in Russian historical consciousness, an event simultaneously remembered and forgotten, celebrated and questioned, present in visual archives but absent from physical commemoration. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the parade lies in its demonstration of how military victory translates into psychological advantage. Beyond tactical success or strategic advance, Soviet leadership understood the power of visual symbolism, the need to transform abstract victory into concrete images. By orchestrating the physical movement of defeated enemies through victorious territory, they created not only a momentary propaganda success, but a lasting visual metaphor for complete military collapse. This understanding influenced representations of later global conflicts. Victory parades after subsequent wars, from US forces marching through liberated Kuwait City in 1991 to Russian troops parading through Grozny after the Chechen Wars, echo aspects of the Moscow precedent. The psychological dimension of war, the importance of visualizing victory, and the power of orchestrated humiliation are partially derived from lessons demonstrated in July 1944. Ultimately, the legacy of the Moscow parade reflects the complex intersection of military history, propaganda techniques, psychological warfare, and collective memory. What began as a calculated display of Soviet triumph and German defeat evolved into something more complicated, a visual artifact that simultaneously documents historical reality and constructs narrative meaning. The columns of prisoners who marched through Moscow on that summer day have long since vanished, but the images of their procession continue to shape the understanding of how victory and defeat are not only achieved, but represented, recorded, and remembered.